Okay, I'm going to show you how to glaze a very small pinch pot. There are going to be larger ones, but I'm going to use this little one for time's sake. I'm going to get a damp sponge, just brush off any dust that could be on here, because this could really make my glazing job worthless, because the dust could ruin the glaze. So it's just a damp sponge wiping that out, and that's pretty good. And you got to make sure that that dries off, so I'm just going to give it a second. I'm going to use a Blick Plum glaze, which is kind of a purple. You get a little preview right there. I've got a simple paintbrush. I got a little cup here just to portion out my glaze, and then a cup of water here to rinse off my brush. So first things first is you always got to make sure that your glaze has been shaken up a little bit, and you are always going to make sure the lid is on tight, or you're at least holding on to it to make sure that you don't dump it all over yourself, which I did last year and it was not cool. And sometimes these things are glued on pretty good, so you got to be careful and not wrench it open too hard. Pour a little bit in there. And then seal this back up. Good enough. All right, that's gonna be good enough for dry. So I'm gonna load my brush up with some glaze, and then best way to do this is to be very systematic about it, so you know where you started and where you finished, so that you can go back and do your second coat in the proper place. Because one of the most important things about glazing is being even. Now, this is just my first practice run of glazing with you all, so I'm not terribly concerned about a couple of fine details, which we will get into at another time. But really, I want to emphasize the point of even brush strokes, seeing how certain areas don't get enough glaze, making sure that I'm being consistent so that I don't ruin anything. Because the thing about glazing is that what you see is not always what you get. It's very difficult to tell if you've done something poorly until it's been fired. Because right now this looks like pretty even coverage, but then after it gets fired, I could have some thin spots. And so for that reason alone, it is worth it to put more glaze on. But the reason that you actually need to put more glaze on is that one coat alone will not really be opaque. And also there's always going to be little bare spots. So you can see just by looking at it where it's dry or drying, where it's still wet. The first coat will dry very quickly, because the porous surface of the clay will soak up all the moisture real quick. And we need to do 3 coats of this color if we want anything close to an opaque application. If you do 4, you're pretty much guaranteed, because this is a cheap glaze and it's kind of thin, and so you definitely want to have an adequate application of glaze. Now, it is possible, if you don't do a great job of glazing, to add more to it and fire it a second time, but that is a lot of time to take when it's preferable to finish this up the first time. But as I've been saying all along, we learn from our mistakes, correct them, and move on. Now, something I am being very aware of as I glaze this with my second coat, and I was with my first coat, is that I am trying very hard to not get any glaze on the bottom. Now you can kind of see where it's meeting the edge, and that's pretty tight on the edge. I know how this glaze works, and so I know it's not gonna run very much, but some glazes run a lot, And so when you fire it, it could drip down as it melts and go onto the kiln shelf, and then it's stuck, it's fused to the kiln shelf. And the only way you're gonna get it off is to bash it with a hammer, and then you've ruined everything. So what I will do here at the end, when I get to my last coat, is I will go ahead and use my wet sponge and brush off the edges a little bit. It's a pretty simple process, but that'll ensure that I don't let any glaze run off the sides onto my kiln shelves. Ruin my piece, ruin my shelves, ruin everything. For the sake of time, I am not waiting for my outside to dry before I brush on my inside, but ordinarily I would probably want to hold this piece while I brush on the inside. This is where our observation skills need to be really applied to look for any blank spots that we missed, because while you might not really notice them right now, after that is fired, you will definitely notice them, because the white part of the clay will really stand out. First and second coats, you tend to not have to wait too long before you put them on, that time between the first to apply the second. But that third one, you definitely have to wait a little bit. Just doesn't dry as quickly because there's that layer of dry glaze in between the clay and your second coat. Now, other glazes, more expensive, higher quality glazes, they will take a lot longer to dry. They can be a little bit thicker, so they don't brush on quite as easily as this one's going. All right, I'm gonna wait a minute, and I'm not gonna make you wait with me, so I'll see you in a second. Okay, we're back. It's just been a few minutes. Things are mostly dry. Still see a little bit of moisture on there. And so I have decided to go completely rogue and do something wild and unexpected. I'm gonna clean off my brush and my water. Got a towel, you guys can get paper towels to dry out brushes. I am going to layer some of this candy apple on the rim, a little bit on the outside, a little bit on the inside. We get some drips, just cause. We're just gonna see what happens. You can layer glazes from time to time. Some of them don't layer very well. Some of them layer very well and have some fun effects. And so we're gonna see what happens when you put candy apple on top of plum. Half the fun of ceramics is just going, I wonder what'll happen if I do this, because there are endless combinations of things. Pairing different glazes with different clays, pairing different glazes with each other. So I'm just kind of adding it sort of on the outside of the edge and just sort of letting gravity and viscosity take over. I can see I'm going to get some drips on the table, so I'm going to have to clean those off the bottom because I can't allow that to continue. That cannot survive that way because it will melt onto the kiln shelf, and that's all bad. All right, I think I'm good there. So I need to let that dry up a bit, and then I can clean off the bottom. I really want to emphasize the cleaning off the bottom because that's super important for the ultimate survival of your piece. So we'll be back again. Okay, we're looking at mostly dry, so I'm going to show you how to just wipe off the bottom. See all that? That will melt to the shelf, and to be safe, we're gonna make sure that there's nothing else. So I'm gonna take my sponge, I'm gonna go out from the center, and I'm gonna move my sponge around as I get glaze on it. Sometimes it takes a little bit of oomph to kind of push that off. But as I go away from the center, I will end up pushing down on the edge a little bit, and I'll clean off that edge a little. Now there will be another time where we will use a wax on the bottom to prevent any glaze from getting on the bottom of our pieces, but we'll save that for another time. Otherwise, this is pretty good, okay? Nice and clean. Any of those little stains don't matter. There we go, all done.